Just like the European influences on early childhood education, we had a lot of influences right here in the United States. And there were two big movements going on. You can see from the shapes in the slide, we have a child care movement, which was a separate movement, going on the same time as we had three other very interconnected movements: the kindergarten movement, the nursery school movement, and the progressive education movement. Now, I'm going to start with our triangular model first and really go through these three different movements. Again, they were separate, but they were intertwined, which means they influenced one another. In the early, I don't know, 1800s, I guess 1850, 1860, the kindergarten movement was beginning. We had a woman by the name of Margaret Schurz, and she had studied Froebel's model and decided she was going to start her own little kindergarten for her children and for her neighborhood. And based on the works of Froebel, where children are a garden, she began teaching an educational environment for 5 and 6 year olds. And this was the start of kindergarten. What we find, though, is who is really known for the first kindergarten is Elizabeth Peabody. And in Boston in 1860, Elizabeth Peabody organized the first English speaking kindergarten. Something else that was important around this time is she began the first kindergarten teacher textbook. Trained under Froebel, she understood that teachers teaching young children needed to be educated in the appropriate practices that would allow them best to learn. Up until this time, reading was very structured. Children learned the 3 R's: reading, writing, arithmetic, and school was very much rote memorization and pencil and paper tasks. In my mind, I think of Little House on the Prairie, where they sat there. For those of you who have seen those episodes, and they sat and they worked, and school was not an active process. It was very individualized. With the influences that we see around this time period, we see that kindergarten became this new niche for learning, and it looked different than what the older grades were doing in that reading, writing, arithmetic formal environment. Now, Susan Blow expanded kindergarten, and this expansion became a bigger movement to getting public kindergarten for everybody. In 1873, which is about 13 years later, she started the first public kindergarten that allowed all children to be able to go to school when they were 5 and 6 years old. And this was in St. Louis. And this kindergarten that was open to the public was a really neat model. In this model, the children would go to school for a half day, and they would learn in an engaging environment. And the other half of the day, the teachers would be trained on how to teach. And so the purpose for half-day kindergarten actually came out of the need to train our teachers in these developmentally appropriate practices. So they needed that other half of the day to essentially learn the strategies necessary. And so students were getting a new kind of experience. And that moves us into the next movement, progressive education. Like I said before, up until this point, learning was very individualized. But with the works of John Dewey, we saw this progressive movement that was pushing children to learn in a new way. And yes, it was kindergarten, but this was actually expanded into all the grade levels. Progressive education is a push for school to become a more democratic, community-based learning environment. What that meant was our schools were going to be less individualized and independent and more dependent on each other. The teacher was still the leader, but they took a sidestep and became a member of the classroom instead of the person regimenting and ordering everything. Also, this is the first time that parents were involved. So we see parents getting involved and interacting and integrating with the school. Um, Children also had a different role. They were supposed to work together collaboratively and cooperatively to learn. Instead of focusing on the curriculum that was the basics, reading, writing, math, possibly geography and history, the curriculum was developed around the children in your classroom. So teachers had to get to know their students as people outside of the classroom. They had to know their interests and their needs. And so things like sewing and woodworking, cooking, and possibly anything else the child would be interested in, things like nature and, you know, fun and games, movement, those things were brought into the classroom, and instruction took on a more thematic, integrative approach. And teachers really had to change the way that they presented their lessons. So we have this new classroom community of working together and working on things that students like. And we saw that this now becomes that developmentally appropriate model that we see more in classrooms today. John Dewey was basically the mind behind all of this. And he thought instead of just memorizing facts and learning skills, children should become decision makers. They should be able to have some control over their behavior and over the things that they were learning. And in that respect, they would be more motivated to contribute to their classroom and later on to their community and society. Again, this is not that teacher-directed curriculum that we saw up to this point. It was a child-centered curriculum where children were not passive as they were before. They were active learners. And this would definitely impact the way that schools instructed. We saw a huge shift during this time period. And the last movement that happened all around the same time was our nursery school movement. And nursery school was that push for children to leave their homes, even though mom was probably still there, and get some kind of formal, at least social experience with other children before they start formal schooling. Up until this point, most mothers and even grandmothers stayed at home with their children and grandchildren, and children didn't have that opportunity to interact in a structured environment. So the nursery school movement, along with John Dewey's laboratory schools, really focused on how we can better meet the needs of children earlier. And so young children began going to nursery schools. And this was to help develop a nurturing, see the play on words, nurturing and nursery, a nurturing development in them to be more, I guess, working toward that citizenship where we could have children really start to learn from one another. And this became the start of early childhood education. Now, what's really neat about the nursery school movement is the information that was gathered on children in these nursery schools were actually conducted in laboratory schools, in universities with teacher education programs. And this is where teachers would observe the behaviors of young children. They would do research on these behaviors, and from what they were learning firsthand by watching, much like we do during our observational hours, they were developing curriculum and instructional models that fit that developmentally appropriate practice for this age. Patty Smith Hill is known in this early childhood education movement because she believed that girls should be educated, not just boys, and she took these ideas of progressivism and a more integrated society and began really working with teacher education programs. Her experiences as a kindergarten teacher allowed her to really learn the importance of gathering information through observing children. And she became the founder of NACE. And we all know NACE stands for the National Association of the Education of Young Children. But as these nursery schools began to develop in the 1920s and into the 1960s, as the movement for nursery schools grew, she became very concerned about this lack of standards and curriculum, and even the lack of teacher training in the early childhood education field. And what they were seeing is teachers weren't doing a good job of meeting young children's needs in the classroom. So she formed the National Committee of Nursery Schools, and that later became NACE through several different name changes. And this became the beginning of creating programs that were accredited and having staff that were trained. And that's part of the reason why we have these programs here at HAC for teacher training. So this whole basis of the nursery school movement was very, very important to early childhood education and making sure we met the needs of children. Now, the last little component of that nursery school movement were outside of these lab schools where more affluent children were going, we started to see parent cooperative preschools. And this is where parents began to organize their own nursery schools called co-ops, and they would either hire a teacher or they would volunteer in the classroom, and they would basically have a preschool for children in the area. It was play-based and it was based on progressive education. And this grew rapidly, especially in the 1950s and the 1960s. And these preschools basically formed into the preschool programs that we have today. Now, one of the things we see in preschools and nursery schools today is many of them do not need, well, they don't need accreditation. We see daycare centers needing accreditation, but preschools, they do not need to be accredited by NACE, but they still follow those same format. And what you'll find is most preschools have certified teachers and teachers that are also trained in best practices for young children. So this triangular movement is all based on education for children that are ages 5 and 6, our nursery school, 3s and 4s also. But this is new. Prior to this time, children whose parents didn't work or whose mothers didn't work typically stayed home until they entered formal schooling. That's a big change, is to send these children out at younger ages to become socialized. Now, along the lines of the child care movement, we see that following a completely different path than what we just talked about, we see that child care started growing. Up until this time, we had families that were home with their children, but out of social welfare efforts for poor families, and the need for some parents to work, both moms and dads or single parents, child care started. In the later part of the 20th century and the 21st century, we don't see that so much anymore. We see that we have child care, but we see that this was only for, the child care movement was primarily for children living in public assistance. That's not the case today in all means. So let's look at what this child care movement looked like. With the McMillan Sisters, we had children with very poor health, and they were sent to health clinics and open air centers, basically, where working families would have day nurseries. And that means the family would go to work and they would have a place for the children to go while the parents work. We saw a lot of this during the Great Depression and World War II, when families were essentially dirt poor in our country and moms had to work, especially during the war. They didn't have anywhere for the kids to be. And so what we see is they created nursery schools basically from 9 to 5 so parents or moms could work, support their family, and the kids would have somewhere to be. Now, the problem with this model that differs a lot from this side is the teachers had hardly any training. They were essentially babysitters. A lot of times they were someone who was looking to be paid to work with kids. And we were having really poor experiences in this childcare movement. The health was bad, the children were bad, the teachers were bad. It just wasn't a good model. Now, the Lanham Act during World War II was when the government got involved, and they created an emergency funded work site. It would last for 10 to 12 hours a day. And one of the famous centers was in Oregon, and it would be open for 24 hours a day. That became the model for quality child care. They provided health services, nutritious meals, parent education, teacher training, and that play-based education model for young children. This was really also to help out the mothers. Okay, so those mothers, they weren't getting meals. They could come and eat at these centers that were open 24 hours a day. So not only were the children getting healthcare services and food, the mothers were as well. And they ended when the war ended because they no longer had mothers that needed to work as the fathers re-entered the workforce. But these high-quality centers became the ideal place for childcare that basically re-emerged again. And it really wasn't until the 1980s when we had employer-based childcare centers created at certain jobs. I know that's a big perk of jobs today if you can bring your child and they have a center there. So it's a very similar model today as we saw back then during the war. So that childcare movement just kind of emerged out of need, and prior to the Lanham Act really was poor. It was bad. But we saw that change, and that change with the Lanham Act really created the quality center that we see today with childcare.